Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Over the last few sessions, we've been looking at how we activate and develop the Noble Eightfold Path. And in particular, we've been looking at right intention. And right intention is really around how we think. What is skillful thinking? What is wholesome thinking? And so this comes back round to a meditation that we've been doing for a while now, which is the Vatthupama Sutta. So now seems a really good moment to look at skilled mental states, but also to deepen our understanding of this sutta meditation, and also how we practice the Vatthupama Sutta. So let's begin by looking again at why this teaching is important. So this particular teaching from the Buddha. The Vatthupama Sutta is often underestimated and not often practiced regularly or very well. The Vatthupama Sutta not only activates the Noble Eightfold Path, it also aligns with the Anumāna Sutta, which enables us to be easy to instruct because we are removing the mental stains, which are included in the Anumāna Sutta. It also helps to remove any of these blocks to understanding the Dhamma. Often, when the mind is polluted with defilements, it makes it difficult to lift the mind in order to be able to cognize the Dhamma. And so that's very helpful. And of course, when you are actively developing the Noble Eightfold Path by doing this sutta meditation, then you are able to activate Noble Right concentration. And this is very important. When we go through the Vatthupama Sutta, you see that the Buddha shows us the pathway to the jhanas. And as we know already, the Vatthupama Sutta is in many ways the prerequisite for being able to develop the Brahmaviharas. And this is explicitly stated in the Vatthupama Sutta. And so the result of all of this practice with the Vatthupama Sutta is also that when you remove those mental stains, those unskilled states, you begin to develop the skilled states. And this is probably something that is not emphasized enough. We tend to give a bad rap to the Vatthupama Sutta because people think, oh, it's only defilements and unwholesome states and people won't want to listen to that, or they won't want to practice that, or it's extremely negative. But if you remember, Noble Right intention, and particularly with the Vatthupama Sutta, when you remove the unskilled states, you actually start to see the skilled states. And this is what we'll look at today, being able to see that. And as you do so, then the rest of the path comes together because your right intention aligns with the right view. And of course, this ultimately leads to Nibbana. This particular meditation will take you through the whole way. It's a meditation that is very useful for the rest of the spiritual life as you chip away and see that when you overcome unwholesome, unskilled states, then what you're left with is wholesome mind states. When you look at it that way, you see how it leads into the Brahmaviharas, which are really, when you cultivate them to that immeasurable level, to even the liberations, they are the doorways to Nibbana. As we know from looking at the Mahachattarīsika Sutta and also the Deveda-Vitakka Sutta, we know that right view leads. And so with the Vatthupama Sutta, we know that when we understand that the 16 mental states that the Buddha talks about is about akusala, and we know that when we purify these unwholesome states, these mental states, then we begin with right view. And when you begin with right view, you start looking at the type of thoughts. So right intention at that moment aligns with right view. When we purify the mind, and what we really end up with is skillful mind states. And that's something that hasn't been emphasized when we've looked at the Vatthupama Sutta. But very clearly, what we'll go through today is to see that you end up with much more wholesome mind states. When right intention aligns with right view, we know that at that moment, right mindfulness and right effort are activating that. We've made effort in the meditation to remove these mental stains. And right mindfulness is making sure that it aligns with right view, which is let's abandon the unwholesome or unskilled and develop the wholesome or skilled mental states. When that's in place, when they're aligned, then you know that you're no longer living with greed, living with hatred, and living with delusion. Instead, we're cultivating the non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion part. In our meditation at that moment, we have right speech, we have right action, and we have right livelihood. So when that takes place, we have the grounds for right concentration. Right effort, right mindfulness is making all that happen, ensuring that we're guarding from unwholesome states, unskilled states, and developing skilled ones. We know that when we develop this Noble Eightfold Path, we are abandoning the 5 hindrances. So this is very helpful to us. As we said before, the Vatthupama Sutta aligns and connects with the Anumāna Sutta. Many of the mental stains are included. When you look at the Anumāna Sutta, we've said before that this is a sutta that helps you to practice in order to become easy to instruct, something that helps us to overcome any struggles towards understanding the Dhamma. Vatthupama Sutta works in the same way. You can see that one needs to remove anger in order to be able to be easy to instruct. Also, not having derogation or disparaging, not being envious or stingy, not being fraudulent or deceitful, and not being obstinate or arrogant. There is more to the Anumāna Sutta when it comes to being easy to instruct. There are certain other things as well, particularly around taking feedback and having no evil wishes and being dominated by them. And of course, the last one is not adhering to one's own view. So you can see that the Vatthupama Sutta goes a long way towards assisting us in order to remove some of those blocks, some of those hindrances towards understanding the Dhamma. What the Buddha is really saying is, when our minds are imbued with these things, then it is imbued with greed, hatred, and delusion, lobha, dosa, moha. And so that's what is clouding the mind, obstructing the mind from seeing clearly. Therefore, it's very difficult to concentrate the mind. It can't be emphasized enough that the Buddha's path is really non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And so one has to make a very concerted effort to lift ourselves out of our habitual tendencies towards greed, hatred, and delusion. And so most of us, what we need to make conscious is that we are often abiding in the vicinity of being difficult to instruct. And so when you can see that, it makes it easier to do such meditations as the Anumāna Sutta or this Vatthupama Sutta on a daily basis, because what you're doing is you're trying to remove those obstructions, removing what makes it difficult for us to come towards Dhamma, to cognize Dhamma, to penetrate the meaning of the Dhamma. So with the Vatthupama Sutta, the Buddha gives this simile. Bhikkhus, suppose a cloth were defiled and stained, and a dyer dipped it in some dye or other, whether blue or yellow or red or crimson. It would look poorly dyed and impure in color. Why is that? Because of the impurity of the cloth. So too, when the mind is defiled, an unhappy destination may be expected. Bhikkhus, suppose a cloth were pure and bright, and a dyer dipped it in some dye or other, whether blue or yellow or red or crimson. It would look well dyed and pure in color. Why is that? Because of the purity of the cloth. So too, when the mind is undefiled, a happy destination may be expected. When you read out the words of the Buddha, what resonates is Buddha always talking about purity in the mind, having skilled states rather than unskilled states. And as a result of that, when it is undefiled, a happy destination can be expected. So when we look at this Vatthupama Sutta, it's very important not to just focus on unwholesome mind states, but to balance it out by also seeing the wholesome mind states. And also to know that this meditation is meant to make the mind happy. It's meant to gladden it, enter the jhanas, and develop this concentration where you see very clearly what you don't want to do again. And the Buddha is clearly emphasizing the distinction between unhappy destination and happy destination. So the right view is really emphasizing about karma, mental karma in this case. And so when you realize that and you deeply see it in your meditation, then you make that very strong intention in the meditation not to allow these things to defile the mind again. Now, of course, in reality, on a day-to-day basis, these things do arise when we're at work, going about our business, doing certain things, fulfilling our responsibilities. But the point is in meditation, as we said before, is to make sure that we keep at it, that we see the fruit of the meditation and know in that moment in our meditation that clarity, that purity. And so we keep on with our formal meditation, and eventually what happens is it flows over into daily life. We trust that because of the direct experience that we get in our meditation. And so this simile of the cloth is a very powerful one. It's a very powerful one when you think about a good, well-dyed cloth, like our minds. If we rid ourselves of the impurities and cultivate the opposite of those qualities, then the mind becomes pristine, luminous, bright, filled with light and wisdom. And so that is the outcome that we are looking for, the outcome that we are leaning towards Nibbana, that we cognize and penetrate the meaning of what the Buddha is saying. So what are the 16 defilements that pollute the mind? So as we know, there is covetousness and unequal greed. So in Pali, this is abhijja, visamalobha. Then we have ill will, which is vyapada, anger, krodha, hostility, which is upanaha. This is also labeling, grudging. And then we have derogation, which is makka. This can also be belittling. And then there is disparaging, which is palasa. This can also be bullying, divisiveness. And then we have envy, which is issa, also known as jealousy. And then we have stinginess, which is macharya. And then there is hypocrisy, which is maya, and that can also be pretentiousness. And then there is fraud, which is sata or sateya, and this is also being deceptive. And then the 11th is obstinacy, sometimes also translated as stubbornness. So this is the Dhamma. And then number 12 is competition, which is saramba, which can also be rivalry. And then the 13th is conceit, which is mana in Pali. And then 14, which is an escalation of that, which is arrogance, so atimana. The 15th is vanity, which we know is also intoxication, which is mada. And then the 16th is negligence, pamada, which we also know as heedlessness, leaning towards the worldly aspects. So all of these defilements are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's important for right view to understand that they are rooted in the unwholesome. And so if we don't abandon them, what can happen is what is in our mind comes out in our speech, and then also comes out in our physical actions. So that's why it's good to tame the mind, to purify the mind. So if we're able to have a purified mind with skilled mental states, then what comes out is more wholesome speech and more wholesome physical action. So it's very important. It means that we can cut off certain other unwholesome activities. Let's now go through the 16 mental stains. And in this particular session, we won't focus on explaining a great deal about the mental stains, but more focus on the bigger picture, where it leads to when you meditate on this sutta for a long time, and also to emphasize what are the wholesome mind states that are cultivated when you abandon the unwholesome ones. And so the first one is covetousness and unequal greed. So this is abhijja visamalobha. So this is really about coveting, longing for, and it becomes excessive wanting. That's why it says unequal greed. It's more than your fair share. It's more than what is needed. It's excessive. You can see very much that it's rooted in greed. So we are highly conditioned towards not being happy with what we already have. You can think of this as something that is part of society, the world we live in. It's never enough. The world is bombarding us with, you need this, you must want that, and to compare and then want more. And so what happens in the mind as a mental stain or as a mental defilement is, I wish that was mine. I want that to be mine. I must have it. When you keep cultivating that, at the very base level, it's always about material things. So it could be someone else's house, car, belongings, possessions. It can then also be about someone's physical appearance and wanting that particular physical appearance. So a lot of this is around subha. It colors our mind. It's very much wanting something more pleasing, what we perceive as pleasing. And at that point, we are rejecting or not seeing the truth of what it really is. Where that really escalates to, if you look at the bigger picture of a bija and you link it to the Karaniya Metta Sutta, what we covet the most is this body. When you look at that bigger picture, if you don't give that up, then you're wanting to come back into a mother's womb. You're wanting to come back to another existence to enjoy these pleasures. It's quite important when you see it all the way to that point. It's the last one that you clean before you make that determination not to come back into a mother's womb. And so what you really want to overcome is the perversion, the corruption in the mind that sees subha, sees the fair, sees the pleasing, sees the beauty in sensual objects and craves it, wants it, covets it. When you do this meditation, when you remove covetousness and unequal greed, what remains? What is left over? What is left over is really contentment, this santussako. So we are happy with what we have. We are okay with simplicity, not acquiring more. What we have is good enough. We're also with renunciation. So you understand nekkhamma. I don't need that. I give it up. And in a bigger picture sense, the nekkhamma, the renunciation is really, I give this up in order to overcome tanha, to overcome the craving, and in order to walk this Noble Eightfold Path. And so that becomes very powerful, because when you see, you truly see the abhijja visamalobha, this covetousness and unequal greed, you recognize, I don't want to keep replicating this mess, to keep coming back at the whim of my kamma into samsara, this magnitude of samsara. And so when these things are in place, you become easy to support. All these things that we talk about, contentment, renunciation, becoming easy to support, they lead into metta, you can see it. And when you are easy to support, you don't have such strong preferences and people like to support you. And so these are the things that you get. The mind gets very peaceful because it is content with what one has, not picky, not having preferences, being able to renunciate. This pathway that the Buddha gives, renunciation, is very important. If you can't give up now, when will you give up? It certainly won't be at the point of death. And so this gradual training is very much learning the importance, the value, the preciousness of renunciation. The second one is illwill or vyapada. So this is mental hate towards something or someone. It comes in the form of resistance or aversion. And so we know this when we get annoyed, irritated, hurt about something, offended, sad, disappointed. And this even arises when we've been ignored. And so how we recognize it in the mind, it's when we think, I don't want that person to be around or to come at me or to interact with. Or we think, I hope that person doesn't come today. I hope they're not invited, or something of that nature. We clearly know that this is rooted in hatred. And it is something that really obstructs the mind from entering into jhana. So when we look at ill will and when we clean the mind of ill will, the question is, where does this get to? And one of the very strong things about ill will is when it comes to developing the mind, we know that the Buddha says one needs to be secluded from defilements, from unwholesome states. And ill will is one of the very important ones, because out of ill will, it is then that we would escalate and want to hurt people. It would come out in speech and action. And as we know, the higher sila training is around not even doing the slightest wrong. And so if you indulge in ill will, knowingly and unknowingly, but particularly knowingly, it is not very helpful at all to the path. So when you clean the mind of ill will, it's important to recognize that now you have non-ill will, what could be described as goodwill towards others. If you have purified the mind, clean the mind of ill will, then what you have is more gentleness in the mind, more of an ability not to want to harm, to hurt others through body, speech and mind. And so that's a very skilled state. When you really look at ill will, you really see the texture of the mind is ready to be averse, to get annoyed, to get irritated. And so when you work with it, what happens is the wholesome side of it is less inclined in that way. The mind becomes stronger, more insulated, because you understand that even with ill will, there is also the ability to make this unwholesome karma. And so you don't want to do that. You want to align with right view. And so noble intention must be to renunciate. So this can be a very powerful thing. If you can nip it in the bud at ill will, it doesn't escalate further. But that is a very high practice. And so one who cultivates a lot of metta, you start to see a lot of these things fall away, because you recognize there is no room for ill will, anger, and all these other defilements. Part of understanding ill will, the bigger picture, is that when we birth this body, we adhere ourselves to ill will because of the aging, sickness, and death. That's the bigger picture. And so all these little ones that we cleanse ourselves of, it's because of having birthed the body. Ill will at work, ill will on the road, ill will at home, ill will with friends, ill will with largely people we know, and of course also people we don't know. But a lot of it arises with people we know, groups of people we know. So the ill will that is ever present is because we have birthed this body and come to realize this body is subject to fail. It is going to age, it is going to get sick, it is going to die. And so if you ever pay attention when either you are sick or starting to age or right deep into the aging process, and when you have to deal with the death of loved ones, you see how much ill will really arises. Sometimes we call it sadness, but it's really the same thing. And so when it comes to understanding all these more petty instances of ill will, you need to also see the bigger picture. The third mental stain or defilement is anger, krodha in Pali. And as we know, it's wishing harm on another. So this is an escalation, as we said before, from ill will. The mind is now flooding with mental hate. That little irritation, resentment, or aversion, it now becomes more intense. And so when anger arises, we start to think, someone has harmed me or my loved ones in the past, or someone is harming me or my loved ones now. And then of course we think, someone will harm me or my loved ones in the future. The Buddha says that if we are prone to anger and irritation, the result will be that we're reborn in an unhappy destination. And if we're reborn as a human being, then we're reborn with ugliness. So that's the karmic result. Now, when you see the downside of anger, so this is when we're angry at home, when we're angry at the politicians, when we're angry at work, when we're angry about a whole multitude of things, particularly external things. And when we clean the mind, particularly of these little examples that we use that happen in daily life, when we remove anger, what we're left with is kindness. Because we actually see in our meditation, if we're really honest, sometimes or quite often we lie. We fix things in our mind that this is what happened and this person was at fault, and we're angry at that person. Usually when we meditate through our examples, we get this direct experience that we lie. Maybe we don't have the full picture. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe we have a bias towards ourselves. And in actual fact, we do have a bias towards ourselves. We adamantly hold on to what we believe is true. It's actually a duvacha quality, being difficult to instruct. Anger has this way of being very strong, like a very strong current, and so you believe all the things are happening as true. You don't see another person's perspective. There's no air to breathe when one's angry. It's very tight and compact. And so there's no kindness towards others. There's wishing to harm others. And in that instance, it's very strong. So what becomes important when you remove anger is to really not believe one's personal dukkha, that someone is harming you, someone has harmed you, or someone will do that in the future. And that applies also to loved ones. We can get very angry. And you can see that out in the world. The world has the standard operating mode of anger. Angry about everything. And there's plenty to be angry about if you go looking for it. And so the idea is not to do that. The idea is to actually see what the Buddha says. One can be reborn in an unhappy destination, and the outcome is not good. And it's important to taste in the meditation that what you're giving up when you give up anger is you're giving up wanting to harm others. What you're left with is non-harm, not wanting to hurt people, having kindness in the mind, understanding the dukkha that we're all facing. I think this is one of the strongest things. The most powerful thing is to understand whoever it is one was angry with, that person is my brother or sister in this cycle of birth, aging, sickness and death. They experience the same as I do in that bigger picture. And they may not understand the Dhamma, so they're in a more precarious situation. So when you see that, rather than these little things that we get angry about, it's important to see that they face exactly the same dukkha that we do. And so when there is kindness towards others and wishing no harm, what you're ultimately offering is safety. Eventually what happens is all beings, they don't feel like you will attack them, harm them, in your mind, in your speech, in your actions. They feel safety, the abhayadana. And so that's what you give when you don't get angry. And so that's a very important quality to have. It goes a very long way from a Brahmavihara perspective. And ultimately it makes it easier for us to lean towards Nibbana. The fourth mental stain or defilement is hostility. So this is upanaha in Pali. This is again escalating or worsening anger. When we had ill will, it became anger. Now it's hostility. So we start to label people as this or that. We start to call people names. And we hold grudges. So these can be little grudges or long-standing grudges. So this arises because we are repeatedly angry with someone or something, and we're holding on to that as permanent. And so we get a lot of energy around hostility. Sometimes we don't recognize, but we have this corruption in the mind that enjoys being hostile towards others. It's kind of a sick corruption in the mind. And so we become very self-righteous, thinking, how dare they do such and such? What a terrible person, and call them names. And we adamantly are assured when we say to other people, oh, that person is such and that person did this or that and is always like this. And so that's what it sounds like in the mind. It's quite harsh. When you think about how harsh it is, there's a holding on to something and not wanting to let go. It becomes quite rigid around it. Rigid kind of thinking, very rigidly in dukkha actually. When someone is hostile, it's important to see there's great dukkha in being hostile, holding grudges and wanting to name call. Very unwholesome, rooted of course in hatred. So when you clean the mind of hostility, you use your own examples. One needs to be quite honest about these things because there is a build-up. Like over time, Vatthupama, the meditation on these defilements, it starts to chip away at these grudges and these labeling. But we can often be surprised that the more we do Vatthupama Sutta meditation, we find that, oh, there's more. And you find out lots of different instances come out of the woodwork when you really try and delve deeper into it. There can be some deep-seated, unforgiving stances for different kinds of people, particularly in families and particularly at work. And of course friendships as well. Because you think, how dare they accuse me of that, or how could they side with that person, and whatever the label is. And so when you look at this cleansing of the mind, when we purify the mind of hostility, what results is that we become more forgiving because we no longer want to hold that grudge. We no longer want to bear this very strong and intense anger towards someone. We're ready to renunciate, to let go. So that's the very good outcome. That's the wholesome state. Again, because it escalates from anger, we don't see the other person suffering, that they are also subject to aging, sickness and death. And so when we focus more on the bigger picture with all these things, we do become more forgiving. We are less prone to want to hold on to the grudge. And so again, similar to anger, if we are someone who cultivates more of these skilled states of mind, being willing to abandon unskilled states, then people find more safety with us. They learn that we are unwilling to hold grudges. We are not prone to get angry and to be hostile. They feel safe to be themselves. So this is the good side of it. And internally, we can know that we are offering safety. We can know that we don't want to cultivate hostility. When you look deeply at this, you know how horrible it is to be around people who are hostile, so very angry to the point that they're unforgiving. That unforgiving nature is really obstructive. It's the reason why one would go to war with people in a normal sense, and then war at that very large scale. And so if you don't want to have that kind of mind state, know that when you cleanse the mind, you're going against it and you're cultivating more inclusion, more safety, more forgiveness, good qualities. Forgiveness only comes from understanding the truth of our predicament, and understanding the karma as well. The fifth mental stain or defilement is derogation, or makka in Pali. So this is having contempt or strong dislike for someone. And what we do when we have this is we cut them down. So we remove their good qualities. So of course we know this is conditioned by anger. This includes belittling, making derogatory remarks. So it sounds like, oh, that person doesn't deserve that promotion or that good opportunity, or they don't have what it takes. They don't have the skill or the experience or the qualities that are needed. They shouldn't be this or that. And so that's how we cut people down. We actually lie because we make these sweeping statements, not taking into account maybe the areas that they do have. Because sometimes we are a little bit right, but largely we lie. And so it's important to see the lie when we derogate. So when we clean the mind of derogation, we're raising above this petty quality that comes from anger. When we're angry with people, we can never be happy for others. We can never be happy for others' good fortune, their hard work, their gains. So it's very important that when you cleanse the mind of the unskillful state, what's left is really the joy, being able to be happy for others, being able to allow people to be fortunate. What we don't see in the bigger picture is karma. The result of karma that is experienced in this lifetime is due to what has been cultivated before. So that's what we miss. We forget that and we think, oh, it must be something else or what have you. But what is ripening now, what comes to fruition now, is due to what has been cultivated in the past. So that is that person's good fortune, where if they have studied hard, then they get the good result. If they have done good deeds before, then they may get the gains now. That's something to understand. And so when you cleanse the mind of even the wrong view around these things, then what you're left with is being happy for others, having joy for others, and not having that bitterness in the mind. Even when someone has beauty in this lifetime, it's due to what they have cultivated before. So someone who doesn't have anger and irritation, then they will be born with beauty. And so someone who is beautiful in this lifetime hasn't harnessed or cultivated anger and irritation or been prone to those things in the past. So when you understand that, you realize that that person is the owner of that karma. Therefore you can be joyful for that person. You see the Dhamma behind it. The sixth mental stain is disparaging, palasa in Pali, and it's divisiveness or bullying. So it's based on strong likes or dislikes and pretty much our preferences. So when we have hostility or grudging, where we label people, this is an escalation from that. So what we do is we measure, evaluate, we divide, separate, block, split, and exclude. So what it sounds like in the mind is, let's not invite that person, or I prefer only this group. So you're evaluating and then putting blocks. What we know about palasa is that it leads to divisive speech. This is where in the mind it translates into unwholesome speech. So what the Buddha says is, if we're prone to divisive speech, then the result will be rebirth in an unhappy destination, or if one is reborn as a human being, it results in being divided from one's friendships or the breaking up of one's friendships or relationships. So it's very good to know that when you separate or split or divide, it results in that in the future as well. So that's not something that all of us would like. So there are many examples where in everyday life this can occur. When you deeply meditate on this particular quality, you recognize that it's deeply ingrained in how we are conditioned. We see that we're always blocking, splitting, excluding, and so on. And this is because of the labeling. We put things into boxes and then that's how we operate from. So in the meditation, it's very good to look at that, to look at the mundane examples. So what happens when you clean the mind of disparaging? What is true is that you are no longer prone to dividing and splitting and excluding. And so the wholesome state that becomes more nourished is the one where one is more inclusive. And in doing so, you offer safety again, because people don't feel like they're excluded and the mind becomes less split, where these strong preferences start to dissipate. And so one is more prone to being equanimous. The bigger picture with disparaging is that you start to understand the different shades of equanimity. So when you perceive the world, you see that the world is immersed very strongly in disparaging, in divisiveness. And so as part of the spiritual practice, you recognize that if you keep getting pulled into more of the same as what is in the world, then it's very hard to get out of this samsara. And so part of developing this Noble Eightfold Path is to go beyond that. And the Vatthupama Sutta is very strong when it comes to being able to deepen one's practice and to see. The seventh mental stain is envy, or issa in Pali. And we know this as jealousy, resentment, unhappiness in the mind towards others' gains or successes. Deep down we think it should be me or mine. This is something that's usually covered when this defilement is present. But it's actually there, and it's conditioned by derogation. One of the strong things we think, he or she can, I can't. He or she has, I don't. This can be very prevalent when we're not conscious of it. But this world is actually filled with a lot of envy or jealousy. You just have to look at our social media portals and you see that these are envy portals. We're always looking at what's happening with other people and feeling that sense of lack. The Buddha says that if we're prone to envy or resentment, the result will be rebirth in an unhappy destination. But if we're reborn as a human being, then one is born with insignificance or no influence. So these are the things that one contemplates in the meditation. And there are so many scenarios where this can arise. One of the important things to see is that sense of me and mine within both derogation and envy. There's a sense of possessiveness that is included in the mental stain. And so when you clean the mind of envy, you ask, what is it that remains, or what is it that is being cultivated when you remove the envy or jealousy? And what is present and what is starting to grow when envy is absent? You start to see how difficult it is to have these successes and gains, that it takes hard work, that a person endures so much in striving for gain, striving for success. We know this to be true from our own struggles. When we have a job, it's very difficult, and to be successful, one has to jump through a lot of hoops. In order to have a family and to maintain, it takes a lot of work. And so there's tremendous suffering, and largely it is jatapi dukkha in order to have these worldly benefits and tendencies. You start to have more compassion towards others when you truly see suffering. We don't seek sukha in the wrong way, but we understand that these things are fleeting. These things can turn. These things deteriorate. And so it's a wonderful thing when you understand the bigger picture about the sukha dukkha vipallasa, and when you really intensely understand where envy is coming from. When you truly start to understand the nature of samsara, you start to see the silliness of envy. We envy those that are all subject to old age, sickness and death in this vast, beginningless samsara, which also has no end. And so when you deeply contemplate that, you also see the futility of having such a quality. It's like, what are we envious of? So in many ways, it's really good to be able to let go of the worldly craving and replace it with wanting to enter the stream, wanting to have path and fruit, wanting to be like the noble ones. That is far safer because it is more wholesome. The eighth mental stain is stinginess, or macharya in Pali. This is where we're protective of our gains or benefits. We're not willing to share. We have this selfishness. So it's the complete opposite of generosity. As we know, there are 5 kinds of stinginess. So stinginess in gains, stinginess in dwelling, stinginess in families or groups, stinginess with reputation, stinginess with Dhamma or knowledge. And it's conditioned by hostility. So what this sounds like is, I don't want to share, I don't want to give, I want to keep this for myself, I don't want anybody to know about it. It's also, let's not invite this person, let's keep it to this group. So these are the various ways that it can arise in the mind. And so we've been through before the examples when it comes to the 5 kinds of stinginess. The Buddha says that if we're prone to stinginess, the result will be rebirth in an unhappy destination, or if we're reborn as a human being, one is poor. And so these are the things that one wants to contemplate in the meditation. If we are stingy, it is a very big block to loving kindness. Loving kindness, if you know, when it is immeasurable, it's boundless metta that the Buddha is teaching in the Karaniya Metta Sutta. And so when we have strong preferences and we bear grudges to people, then effectively we are cutting off being able to cultivate metta towards those people or towards those groups. Our metta becomes based solely on our preferences. And so at that point, it's very difficult to see that all living beings are our brothers and sisters in birth, old age, sickness, and death. So when it comes to cleaning the mind of stinginess, it's apparent that the wholesome or skilled state of mind that is being cultivated is one of generosity, being able to give. When we give up stinginess, we give up selfishness. And so what we're left with is this quality of inclusion, this quality of wanting to share, wanting to give. When we again look out into the world is imbued with stinginess, separateness, exclusion. The world talks about diversity, but in reality the terms that the world is talking about is labeling, grudging, and therefore stinginess. There is no metta in the world when you look at it like that. So this is a complete block even to liberation, because the mind remains small, weak, stingy, selfish, me and mine. So where you want to get to when you look at the bigger picture, in order to lean towards Nibbana, one has to let go of all the different preferences, boundaries, labels, grudges, stories behind those grudges, stories behind those labels. Metta is one of the doorways to Nibbana, and in order to access that doorway, similar to the other doorways of compassion and joy and equanimity, one has to let go of these defilements. And in the case of metta, one has to let go of stinginess. The 9th mental stain or defilement is hypocrisy or maya. This is where we pretend to have good qualities that we don't have, or we hide our bad qualities. And so there's a kind of pretentiousness that is behind this particular defilement. It's linked to envy. And so when you see envy and you look at the Nyanapada that starts with anger and derogation, envy, and now hypocrisy, the thread that runs through it is the lie. So when it comes to hypocrisy, what we do is we behave in a very fake kind of manner. There's a lie behind it. We're pretending to be something that we're not. We're pretending to uphold values that we're not. So there's a deceit behind it. So it's very easy for us to recognize it in other people. The more difficult one is to actually recognize it in ourselves. And particularly in Dhamma circles, quite often we fall into the trap of needing to show that we know more than we actually do, that we have insight into more than we do, rather than admitting that Dhamma is also yet to be understood. It's better to overcome this particular quality by admitting at least to oneself that one is not an arahant, and so you can't know everything. You haven't fully penetrated this teaching. And so that's a place where you're able to do better, just by that truth alone, where you admit that there is a certain level of hypocrisy. So in the world today, it's very apparent that the world holds on to certain ideals, certain views about certain things. And living up to those things is often where the world falls short. Things, particularly in leaders, when we look at world leaders and they're telling us one thing and then they do another. So this could be politicians, this could be royalty, this could be business leaders. And at the ground level, it could be people that we work with who are in positions above us. You say one thing and you do another. Or when you look on social media and you see that people are lying, they're faking it. So you can see why you would want to cleanse the mind of this particular defilement. The reason why it's linked to envy is because when you are envious or jealous of what somebody has or what somebody can do, then often you want to project that you also have those qualities. And so there's a hypocrisy to it when you pretend and when you give this kind of impression that you know more than you know, that you have more than you have, and so on. And sometimes also the hypocrisy comes where at a deeper level we deny that there is dukkha. Deep down we may actually feel this is dukkha. All these things associated with living, birthing into this existence is dukkha. Having to study, having to work, having to hold relationships, having to bend all the time, be flexible, having to strive, and all the other parts of it, being lonely, being isolated, being judged, being not accepted, all of that is dukkha. But at the same time, the hypocrisy comes in when we go out into the world and we pretend. Someone asks us, "How are you?" And we go, "I'm good, I'm fine, everything's great." And what you find after you meditate on this is that part of the spiritual practice is not to pretend. One of the beautiful things about spiritual practice is you can just be. It's okay to admit that there is dukkha. There is something that is deeply profound about being honest about that. And in that honesty, there is joy, there is happiness. It's hard to believe for people who haven't meditated on this before, but there is actually freedom in being more honest about it. And so that's where the meditation really deepens, when you let go of wanting to pretend, wanting to fake it till you make it, wanting to convince or be bullied by the world to say that you're happy. And so when you look at cleansing the mind of hypocrisy, what you're left with is authenticity, or closer to authenticity, and genuinely being more honest about this existence, more honest about the difficulties and challenges, the way that karma ripens. And so with that truth, you start to lean more towards Nibbana, because you start to see that this worldly existence isn't what you thought it was, and it's not meant to be that way. If you don't deny that when you're born, you age, you get sick, and then you eventually will die, then there is power in the freedom of that truth. You no longer have to fake the aging process. You no longer have to feel shameful when you get sick. These bodies are of the nature to age, to sicken, and then of course to die. So hypocrisy at one level can be all these different examples, these worldly tendencies, but at a greater level, there's something quite profound about our predicament, and being able to admit to the predicament and then finding joy in being more authentic, more true to the Dhamma. The 10th mental stain or defilement is fraud, or sathaya in Pali, sometimes shortened to satha. So this is around dishonesty, corruption, cheating, deception, trickery. And it happens because we want to gain something from a situation or from people or groups of people. And this escalates from stinginess when you try to gain more. So you cheat to gain more, or you try to hold on to what you have by deception or trickery. And it sounds like they won't find out if I take this. Oh, they've got a lot, so let me take this. Let me cheat them out of that. And so the world is largely imbued again with corruption and dishonesty. And it happens at the level of one-to-one within families, friends, at work, larger scale in terms of businesses, and then even larger when you look at governments, the level of corruption and cheating. It's a very nasty one when you look in the newspaper and see all these headlines about corporate corruption and bribery, and also you see at the business level people stealing. What the Buddha says is that if one is prone to taking what is not given, the result will be rebirth in an unhappy destination. Or if reborn as a human being, it results in a loss of wealth. So you can really see when it comes to, at the financial level, this stinginess towards gain, wanting to benefit, wanting to gain, that takes a foothold and it becomes wanting to cheat people of money, wanting to commit fraud, to be corrupt. So it's a very unwholesome state that leads to the physical activity of taking what is not given. And so when you look at your own examples and you look at all these sorts of things, you see that the world is very imbued with this. And you can be tainted by this if you associate with people who have this nature, who have this mental defilement that leads to those kinds of physical actions. And so when you cleanse the mind of fraud, you see how much it's rooted in greed. This is not a quality that exists when you lean towards Nibbana. There is a safety, a refuge in leaning towards Nibbana. Nibbana does not have this unwholesome quality. So what happens when you cleanse the mind of fraud? One becomes more honest and one becomes less inclined towards deceiving others and less prone to taking what is not given. One takes more care around those things, to be quite careful about taking what is not given, to be more mindful of what is not yours. And so that's a very good place to practice with. We don't think even in Dhamma that this can occur, but even when you're praised for the type of life that you live in terms of the spiritual life, it can often be quite tempting to inadvertently cheat people. Keeping stronger sila is actually something that you recognize when it comes to fraud. You don't want to take what is not given, and even when it's offered to you, you don't want to cheat people by taking it for something that they think that you have that you don't. And so there's a refinement. As you start meditating more on fraud, you really look deeply, because with many of these mental defilements, one thinks, oh, I don't have that. It's not something that I need to meditate on. It's not something that's very present. But when you peel away, you keep asking that question in meditation. Are there any examples? And with many of these meditations, you go back even to childhood and you find that there are things that it's quite highly conditioned, some of these things, that we pick these things up from our environment, or they're something that is somewhat of an underlying tendency. And so when you really look at it, you start to see, there is something there. None of us are really that honest, because if we were, then we would be leaning more intensely towards Nibbana. But instead, we're still caught up in the world. We're still caught up in wanting things. And so it's very good to look at that. The 11th mental stain or defilement is obstinacy or thambo. And this is where we have very strong views and opinions, and we're unwilling to listen to others. We've said before that most arguments at work or at home or any kind of arguments are really around this obstinacy, this stubbornness, where we have a lot of mental rigidity. It's also known as hard-headedness, inflexibility. A lot of the disputes come from I'm right, you're wrong. And even when you're not with people but you're watching the news or looking on the internet, you think, oh, this person is wrong, their thesis is wrong. And of course you're coming from the position of I'm right, I know what's what. So in the meditation, it's really good to look at this because it's part of being difficult to instruct. From a Dhamma perspective, why we can't take in the Buddha's words and those of the Noble Arahants is because there's too much stubbornness, too much hard-headedness that says what I know is true and correct. When you start to remove the block of this obstinacy, you start to open up to be willing to listen, be willing to be instructed. Most often we listen from closed ears, not eager ears. This happens all the time. It doesn't have to be Dhamma. It could be at work. It could be at home. Someone is telling us something that may be important, but we don't hear it with fresh ears. We hear it with a closed mind, and obstinacy is the one that blocks that. The Buddha says that if one is prone to obstinacy, the result will be rebirth in an unhappy destination, or if reborn as a human being, it results in low birth. That's actually something to contemplate. Most of the time we don't see that there is anything wrong with being hard-headed, having strong views. The world conditions us to be very adamant about our views. Now the Buddha, his main teaching is about what's wrong view and what's right view. That's what he wants us to really focus on. That right view begins with understanding about the Four Noble Truths, and right view also understands about karma and rebirth. And so everything else about science, about politics, about technical details of certain things, they're given much lesser priority when it comes to understanding the Dhamma. And so if we're very prone to obstinacy across a myriad of fields, it's important to look at that. And it's important to look at the different types of arguments and disputes we get into with people. One of the most wonderful things that someone ever shared was to put up the stop sign. When you put up the stop sign, you make an evaluation that it's not important to have such strong views and adhere to them about very worldly matters. And so when you start to loosen the grip of very strong views, then one becomes more flexible, willing to listen, easier to instruct. And of course one becomes less fearful of one's positions on knowledge. It can be quite silly when you're arguing points over mundane matters and you realize in the greater scheme of things, the bigger picture, that what you really want to do, what is the most frustrating thing is trying to understand what you don't know about the Buddha's teaching. And so when we waste so much time investigating, researching all these things about the world, it takes us away from really penetrating the Dhamma. We can be quite obstinate about, I have to know this, I have to know. People will want to know that I know. Very worldly matters. But that is not towards liberation. And when it comes to the Dhamma, sometimes we think, do we need to know everything? And of course the answer is no. But I think in this journey of samsara, it's important to clarify every little bit of Dhamma that supports the Dhamma that we do know, that helps us to penetrate the Dhamma that we don't know, is extremely wholesome. And so rather than be obstinate and get stuck on even Dhamma points, it's really to enjoy that process of the practice of it, the way forward. But when it comes to strong views and opinions, don't let it veer us off developing the Noble Eightfold Path. Don't get caught up in arguments, disputes, even over Dhamma points. Practice and penetrate it so you directly experience it, rather than arguing about it. Put up that stop sign. And so when you look at that, when you remove obstinacy, the mind seems less oppressed. It seems more open. There's a willingness, an openness to the mind, and an openness towards Nibbana. The 12th mental stain or defilement is competition, saramba in Pali, and we also call this rivalry or always wanting to win. So this comes from a drive to outdo others, to surpass their achievements. Sometimes we also call it one-upmanship. Part of being in the world is around competition. You see it when you apply for a job, you see it within families, you see it in friendships, and you see it in terms of popularity and different worldly measuring sticks. So it comes in the mind, I want to beat you, I want to win at any cost, I'm better than you, eventually comes from that as well. So competition is linked to the one that we looked at just before around obstinacy, because when there is mental rigidity, there is also this competition. Now, in the world, we often think, but this is how the world operates. You know, when we have tests and when we have exams and when we are at work and when they give prizes, when there's sports, when there are competing interests in the world, country to country, look at even wars, there's a competition in that, all that sort of thing. But at the heart of competition is a defilement. What you see with competition, if you really look at it, there's a harshness to it, a harshness towards oneself, but also a harshness to competitors. There's always wanting to win, always wanting to beat, always wanting to surpass. When you look at the chapters on kings in the suttas, you see that there is no winner or loser in a competition. Although it appears that there's a winner and there's a loser, if you are defiled by competition, you end up both being losers, because the winner gloats and has all those sorts of things, but the fear behind the win is that you will be surpassed next time. There's a deep-seated fear that you'll never be able to replicate, that you'll be beaten. And for the loser, there is the dukkha of the loss. There's the dukkha of, will I be able to beat this person next time? And there's so much dukkha in striving towards that. So both end up worse off if you really think about it. Competition breeds a lot of unhappiness, a lot of fear. What manifests from fear is often anger and also harshness. We often glorify being driven, but what's driving that is anger. That's what can't be seen. When you look at cleansing the mind of competition, one becomes more gentle, more kind, sees the truth about dukkha. And so you're able to see the suffering for all parties. And so you don't even want to enter into any kind of arena, whether it is a mental arena or whether it is a verbal sparring match or whether it is a physical competition. Effectively, the skilled states are those: gentleness, kindness, being able to have compassion towards others, and also to have less fear. Because what is there to fear if you're not competing? So in a conversation, this is also linked to obstinacy. If you're not wanting to win points, if you're not wanting to assert that your view is the best, then there's nothing to fear. And eventually the person who wants to enter into the conversation and spar with you will also realize that. And so the conversation becomes more peaceful, more gentle, more inviting, there's more warmth to it rather than competitive. And so it's good to see these things. What we're really seeing in most of these defilements is being able to understand the dukkha of it as well. And when you see the dukkha, you also see the craving to outdo others, the craving to be the best, to be somebody. There's a very strong sense of atta, me and mine, that runs through many of these defilements. And so when we remove it, we're removing the hold of those corruptions of the mind, those perversions, those vipallasa. and we're starting to lean more strongly towards the truth and towards Nibbana. What is very true in the bigger picture of it is that the world is very deceptive. Lots of musa Dhamma, lies and deception. When we get caught up in the world, we're with the world, we're with the deception. When we're leaning towards Nibbana, we're leaning towards the truth, wanting to get out of the corruptions, wanting to get out of the bonds to the world. So Vatthupama Sutta, when you start with your examples and you graduate through this meditation to the bigger picture over time, it really reveals a lot. And so it's an encouragement to see that this really reveals a lot to us. The 13th mental stain or defilement is conceit, mana. So we know this as pride, having confidence about who we are and what we can do. There's a form of self-praise when we consider ourselves equal to another. And it's caused by a lack of virtue, because we're overly proud, boastful, haughty, we feel special, and it's very egoic. There's a very strong sense of me and mine, of self. And you can see how this is also linked to competition and obstinacy. We think that we're good. We want to show that. So we're always like, let me tell you about me, what I did and what I have and what I know. And then you compare yourself to someone that you think is the same as you, but they actually probably know more, can do more and have more. But you go, I'm like that person, I'm just as good as that person. Where this is very troublesome is because it's rooted in that sense of atta, that sense of me and mine. Conceit, as we know, is one of the higher fetters, and so we don't disentangle ourselves from this particular tendency as well as defilement, fetter, until we attain arahantship. So it's not an easy one. When we meditate on it using this Vatthupama Sutta, it's very good to understand that. But part of the process is to chip away, not to ignore it, to actually look at situations and instances where we always reinforce atta. So the worldly aspect, particularly when you go to work, is you need to prove yourself. And so there's often, through being around the work environment, a conceit does arise when you specialize in a particular area or where you're successful in your job. And so it's very good to look at that aspect of it. And even when it comes to roles and responsibilities, but particularly roles, whether it's the role of a mother, a father, a teacher, even as a friend, maybe a counselor, a coach, an athlete, whatever that role is, it's really good to look at the associated conceit with it, because when you start to look at it, it starts to reveal itself to you, and so it no longer has that strength. When you start to say, let me tell you about this, you start to hear yourself outside of the meditation because you've already looked at it in the meditation. And so maybe a sense of shame comes up because you're starting to speak in that way and you start to refrain a little, or you listen to yourself consciously say these things out loud. But in the meditation, that's where you really examine it and you really look at what is behind it. And usually it's for acceptance, it's for respect, it's for praise. And these are very worldly tendencies. Part of the bigger picture is that there cannot be any amount of praise that can overcome birth, aging, sickness, and death. What we think we are so good at and so wonderful at and so endowed with can never even surpass this predicament of birth, old age, sickness, and death. So that's one way of starting to break the hold. Another way is we often look at other people who are conceited and we point out their conceit. But then when you look at this human body, for example, we all get hungry, get thirsty, have to go urinate and defecate. And so when you look at it that way, those basic functions, you see, where is the conceit then? Sometimes that's a very good way of equalizing, being able to bring the conceit down. So when we cleanse the mind of conceit, what remains? What is there? What in terms of skilled states of mind? Well, when you really look at it, again, you become more gentle, but essentially you become more humble. Humble about this atta that is subject to birth, old age, sickness, and death. And so you embrace others more rather than keeping people at bay over I'm so-and-so and you're so-and-so. Conceit has this way of having these blocks. And so you become more embracing, and again, you're less fearful. Quite often you see with conceit, if you really pay attention, maybe you can't see it in yourself, but you see it in other people. When someone is conceited, their biggest fear is that they don't get the respect for what they believe they're good at, for what they believe they're praiseworthy for. And so when you drop vast amounts of conceit from the mind, then with that humility, you're less fearful about being judged, about being found lacking, about not receiving the praise or the respect. And so there's something quite liberating about that. And so the skilled mind state is one that people gravitate towards you. When you're humble, people feel like they can come and ask you things, can come and talk to you, can come and ask for assistance. The 14th mental stain or defilement is arrogance. So this is Atthimana in Pali. And this is an escalation from conceit. So we have an even greater conceit. We feel superior and we have a very bloated opinion of ourselves. And as a result of that, we always think that we're right. And it's again caused by a lack of virtue. So both conceit and arrogance are caused by a lack of virtue. The way to understand that is because we think that we're better than other people, because we have this superiority or we think that we know a lot, we take a lot of liberties when it comes to sila. That we are bound by sila. We may not even believe in kamma. So that's where it is dangerous, and that's where it comes from a lack of virtue. Even around fear of wrongdoing and moral shame, the things that guard us from doing the wrong things, often you find that someone who is conceited or arrogant, they don't have that kick in. They don't have that moral sense of shame. They don't have the fear of wrongdoing. And the other part of it is also when one is conceited or arrogant, but particularly with arrogance, you tend to think that you can fix everything, that you can make the conditions last. And so that's a big downfall when it comes to seeing the truth, because as we know, these conditions are subject to change. They're not permanent, they're not lasting. No matter how much we think we can control them, if you look at the bigger picture, due to birth, there is old age, there is sickness, and there is death. There is no one yet that can overcome that predicament. And so if out of arrogance, you constantly think that you can control your conditions, that you can make it last, you can throw money at it, then unfortunately, that is a lie. When we raise ourselves and lower others, which is what arrogance, where that normally comes from, there's a very big sense of, I'm better than you, I know more than you, I have more than you, no one can do what I do. So in the work situation, sometimes you hear that last one, I'm irreplaceable, you need me, and things like that. So if one is prone to arrogance, the Buddha says the result will be rebirth in an unhappy destination. Or if reborn as a human being, it results in a low birth. And so you can see it's almost like you're bloated like a big hot air balloon, and then if you're reborn as a human being, you see that balloon deflated into low birth. So there's something that is smelly, doesn't resonate when it comes to arrogance, particularly around that very strong sense of self, of me and mine. And so very similar to conceit, when you cleanse the mind, purify it, then you become more gentle, more humble, and more embracing of others, but also you become easier to instruct, because now instead of being unwilling to listen, want to listen. Also, as we said before, one becomes less fearful about being judged, being found lacking. The mental stain or defilement is vanity. So this is mother. And we know this also as mental intoxication, or mental infatuation, or even pride. There's 3 types of vanity that the Buddha talks about. There is vanity associated with health, so arogya mada. What we don't see when we are intoxicated with health is it is our nature to sicken. And then the second is yobana, which is intoxication or vanity with youth. And so when we are intoxicated in this way, infatuated in this way, we don't see it as our nature to age. And then the final one is jivita, which is intoxication or vanity about our life. And when we are infatuated in this way, then we don't see it as our nature to die. We focus mainly on life. So you can see that with these types of vanities or intoxications, this is very much what is conditioned or encouraged in the world. Health is seen as such an important thing to be focused on. Good health, good health, good health. And youth, everything is around youth and anti-aging. And then life, so much about our lives, but not about at the end of life, what we are heading towards. And so when you look at even these three things as part of the 5 frequent recollections or contemplations, you see that we have the nature to sicken, we have the nature to age, and we have the nature to die. These are the truths that the Buddha is reminding us all the time, rather than these defilements. If we focus too much on these defilements, what happens is we lose sight of our predicament. Our predicament is exactly that. When we birth this body, we have the nature to sicken, age, and die. And there's no getting out of it. It's liberating when you meditate on this Vatthupama Sutta to really see that. It's so powerful because if you go about your daily life working from this truth, you treat people better. You live each day better. There's no complacency, there's vigilance, there's gratitude. And so it's important to cleanse the mind in this way. Part of Vatthupama Sutta, when you look at vanity, is really part of these contemplations that the Buddha encourages towards. And really, the skilled states of mind, when you cleanse the mind in this way, is humility, being truthful in the very strong Buddha Dhamma sense. And also one becomes far less fearful about the aging process, about when we get sick, and about death. So it doesn't mean that there's no dukkha. There is dukkha because you say jarampi dukkha, vyadhipi dukkha, and also maranampi dukkha. That is true, there is dukkha, but it comes from wisdom, it comes from understanding. So you're no longer shocked by aging, sickness and death. You're no longer scared of it because you're working with it. You understand it. You understand the magnitude of samsara. This one day that we experience now, that's one of something in this endless stream of samsara. And so within that context, it becomes far more powerful. This is one of the most powerful mental defilements to meditate on because it's so linked to what the Buddha encourages us to frequently contemplate. So you can see that the mind gets very purified, very bright when it meditates on this one. The mind gets happy when it's given the truth. Never forget that. When the mind is given the truth, it elevates from the darkness, from the grayness, from being covered by worldly untruths, the deception. The 16th and final mental stain or defilement is negligence, pamada in Pali. So this is our preference or motivation to indulge in things that aren't good for us, usually of a sensual nature. And this is what takes us away from the wholesome. This is also what takes us away or blocks us from Dhamma, from the spiritual life. We often don't care about the consequences of our actions when we're negligent, we're heedless. And this is because there is a lacking in moral shame. There is a lacking in the fear of wrongdoing. And this is highly conditioned. When you look at negligence, you realize that even from birth, when you are crying and there is dukkha, someone gives you a pacifier or someone gives you a toy. And so when you grow up, you find that it's the same thing. When there is dukkha, you try and patch it up. You try and find something to distract from the dukkha. But the Buddha's medicine is really saying, you don't need to do that anymore, because you have something better. You have something that is not just going to get you out of the dukkha that you're experiencing right now, in this moment or in this lifetime. There is a medicine, an antidote to getting out of the whole mass of suffering, getting out of samsara. That's the bigger picture of when you look at negligence. We have little examples of where we think, oh, it won't matter if I indulge in this, or it won't matter if I do these sorts of things, there won't be any consequences, and they start very small. But what you must realize is, in the greater picture, when you really start to see around negligence, and particularly the danger in sensual pleasures and using sensual pleasures as the band-aids to dukkha, then you realize that Buddha has medicine, such as this Vatthupama Sutta, to take us out completely from the whole mass of suffering. And that entails developing the Noble Eightfold Path. So as we said at the beginning, when you do this meditation, because you're correcting the view, so wrong view becomes right view, and with our intention to cleanse our mind of these mental defilements, then you see that noble intention becomes noble right view. They align. What we are doing is we're using our mindfulness and our right effort towards making that happen. And so when we correct it in the mind, then during the meditation we have the right speech, we have the right action, we have the right livelihood. And so the mind concentrates. When we look at negligence, really it's allowing moral shame to kick in. It's allowing the wholesome state of fear of wrongdoing to kick in, to remind oneself of karma, right view. So those are the skilled states, having moral shame, having fear of wrongdoing, wanting to be vigilant as opposed to relaxed, heedless, negligent. The skilled state is really activating the right view. In many of these, all of these, it's really activating the right view when you go beyond the defilement. It's a wonderful thing. So the mind gets very happy with these skilled states. And always remember, when it comes to any of these defilements, and since we're talking about negligence, negligence does not lean towards Nibbana. It's imbued with delusion. And so when you are inclined towards Nibbana, you need to be free of these defilements, these covers. And so when you have the skilled states, such as fear of wrongdoing, moral shame, activating the right view, then you are on the Noble Eightfold Path, leaning towards Nibbana. Mind gets happy. Coming back to the Buddha's words in the Vatthupama Sutta, he says, knowing that covetousness and unequal greed is an imperfection that defiles the mind, a bhikkhu abandons it. Knowing that ill will, anger, hostility, derogation, disparaging, envy, stinginess, hypocrisy, fraud, obstinacy, competition, conceit, arrogance, vanity, and negligence is an imperfection that defiles the mind, a bhikkhu abandons it. He acquires unwavering confidence in the Buddha. He acquires unwavering confidence in the Dhamma. He acquires unwavering confidence in the Sangha. And so this is something we haven't touched on before, but it's very true. When you start to chip away at these defilements, you really start to see Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. You really start to see the truth of the Buddha and what he practiced, what he overcame. His perfect enlightenment to see all these things, to have all these Buddha jnanas. And the Dhamma, when you penetrate the Dhamma, start to understand the meaning, start to experience directly what happens when you practice the Dhamma, the confidence grows. And then when it comes to the Sangha, you remember and you recall all those who have walked before us, who have actually seen and also directly experienced this Dhamma, who represented the good examples. Then your confidence also grows. And so abandoning defilements really elevates the mind. It really gives you the ingredients towards stream entry, path and fruit, further advancement or attainments on the path. So this is a very powerful meditation. So if you continue with the meditation as the Buddha has instructed in the Vatthupama Sutta, when the defilements have been abandoned, the Buddha asks us to actually reflect. I am possessed of unwavering confidence in the Buddha. And so therefore you gain inspiration in the meaning, you gain inspiration in the Dhamma, you gain gladness connected with the Dhamma, rapture arises, the body becomes tranquil, we experience happiness, and the mind becomes concentrated. The same happens when you reflect, I am possessed of unwavering confidence in the Dhamma. And again when you reflect, I am possessed of unwavering confidence in the Sangha. And then finally, you also reflect, the defilements of the mind have in part been given up, expelled, released, abandoned, and relinquished by me. So these 4 reflections, they help you to enter into the jhanas. And you know how that activates. It's because the Noble Eightfold Path has been activated. Right view has aligned with right intention. When we cleanse the mind of these defilements, we have the right intention. It is linked with the right view, it connects. Right intention becomes right view, and therefore the rest of the path is active. When that is in place and you reflect on the fact that you have given up in the meditation these defilements and understood certain dhammas in the process, then the mind becomes concentrated and you see that pathway to the jhanas. And then we get the confirmation about the Brahma Viharas. The Buddha says, he abides pervading 1 quarter with a mind imbued with loving kindness, with a mind imbued with compassion, with a mind imbued with altruistic joy, with a mind imbued with equanimity. Likewise the 2nd, likewise the 3rd, likewise the 4th. So above, below, around and everywhere, and to all as to himself, he abides pervading the all-encompassing world with a mind imbued with loving kindness, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility, and without ill will. He understands thus, there is this, there is the inferior, there is the superior, and beyond there is the escape from this whole field of perception. When he knows and sees thus, his mind is liberated from the taint of sensual desire, from the taint of being, and from the taint of ignorance. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge. It is liberated. He understands birth is destroyed. The spiritual life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no coming to any state of being. Bhikkhus, this bhikkhu is called one bathed with the inner bathing. And so what we see here is, after going through the mental stains or defilements, one is able to then enter into the Brahma Viharas. You can see it as the prerequisite. What you understand when you deeply meditate on the Vatthupama Sutta is you understand all the things as they are. You understand this, you understand what is inferior, you understand what is superior, and then you understand the escape. And so the ending to this particular part of the sutta is very much like what we read in the Vedavitaka Sutta. And it's really lovely how the Buddha says, one bathed with inner bathing. You really see that this path is a path of purification, a path of renunciation. And so when we meditate on the Vatthupama Sutta, it's good to know that it is a very powerful meditation. We're coming to the end of our session on the Vatthupama Sutta and deepening our understanding and practice of this sutta. We can finish with looking briefly at these insight pathways that we've been touching on as we've gone through. The first insight pathway is anger, derogation, envy, and hypocrisy. And the second is anger, hostility, disparaging, stinginess, and fraud. One of the main things that we need to do is to look at these insight pathways and meditate on them. To take an example that shows how this insight pathway works. What we see is that anger is the condition for derogation, derogation is the condition for envy, and envy is the condition for hypocrisy. The thread that really runs through when you look at your own example is with this first insight pathway, we tend to lie. We tend to lie to ourselves about the facts. So when we are angry, we tend to lie about whoever is affecting us. And when we derogate and remove someone's good qualities, that lie continues. We tend to paint them with a very broad brush without understanding that not all of it is true. And same when we envy. It happens because there is this derogation, and this very strong sense of me and mine kicks in. It kicks in when we are angry. It kicks in even more so when we derogate. It's reinforced when we're envious. And so the lies continue, supported by this sense of self. And so when we're envious and we want to show others more than what we have, or pretend that we don't have bad qualities, there is this hypocrisy, and so the lies continue. And so it's very good to take a work example, or take an example when you're with your extended family, or even a Dhamma example where we try and project ourselves in a certain light and we're envious of other people and we end up removing people's good qualities, and deep down we're just angry. That's a very good insight pathway to meditate on. The second one is anger, hostility, disparaging, stinginess, and fraud. So again, you take your own example. The thread that runs through this is around particularly labeling. Out of anger, when you label and hold a grudge and there is no forgiveness, because of these preferences that arise from grudging, from this hostility, this escalation of anger, we end up being divisive through disparaging. In our minds, it's split. We like this group, we don't like that group. We prefer this, we don't prefer that. And so we start setting up mental boundaries, and it can escalate to speech and action. Inherently, what you're seeing in the mind is a stinginess, a sense of wanting to protect, a sense of selfishness and stinginess about whatever the issue is. It could be a gain, it could be a group, it could be around one's reputation, it could be around one's knowledge. And then ultimately what happens due to these preferences and this grudging, and where it all stems from, essentially anger, one tends to be deceptive, to be corrupt. And so that's also a very good one to take an example. It's good to also see that one in the workplace, but also to see it with long-standing relationships. You can take it at mundane example level, or you can take it at the bigger picture. Both of these insight pathways are very, very powerful. And so there's an encouragement there to really look into it, to really see the link and the conditions that escalate these mental defilements. We can end our session here. Gratitude to the Buddha for these wonderful teachings. We bow our heads with respect to the Buddha, to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha. Let's share the merit of this session with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you well. Teruwan Saranai.